What springs to mind when I say London's biggest nightmare? You might say prices of pints or Arsenal, but I'm sure the majority of you would have thought of London's never-ending saga. No, not you Crossrail, but its airport, London-Heathrow, and we will tell you the story of how this aviation juggernaut came about, to the bane of all West Londoners. It's time to go back to the early 20th century, during the early days of flying, when London suburbia went crazy for aviation. The results of this saw multiple airstrips popping up in areas such as Hendon, Croydon, Northolt, and soon to be in a sleepy hamlet that had been around since the medieval times, 15 miles away from London, which went by the name of Heathrow. Heathrow Airport's origins go back to a chap called Charles Richard Fairey, who was the founder of the Fairey Aviation Company in 1915, and at the time was assembling his aircraft in Northolt Aerodrome, about 6 miles away from Heathrow. It was in 1928 when the Air Ministry booted Fairey out of Northolt, and looking for a new place to test his aircraft, Fairey bought 148 acres of farmland near the hamlet of Heathrow, close to his manufacturing plant in nearby Hayes. From this, Fairey would go on to build 3 runways in the 1930s, which would ultimately become the Great West Aerodrome. As World War II would come along, the Air Ministry was secretly making plans to take over the aerodrome using wartime legislation, which it did so in 1944, evicting Fairey from his aerodrome, paying him no compensation for it, in which they had plans to use it for long-range aircraft for the war in the Far East. However, the war ended before those plans were fully completed, with the aerodrome being converted to civilian use. It was later admitted by the Under-Secretary for the Air, Lord Balfour, that the aerodrome was always intended for civil aviation, and that the government used emergency requisition in order to avoid a lengthy public inquiry. The result of this meant that little old Heathrow's destiny would be for big things. With the war ending, London was on the hunt for a main airport to call home. The biggest airport at the time, in Croydon, was boxed in by urban sprawl, so expansion opportunities were limited, so the city would look towards a former military airfield in West London. Work was underway to transform Heathrow into civilian use, with the airport opening as London Airport on the 31st of May 1946. The early passenger terminals were by far from glamorous, being ex-military marquees, which formed a tented village along the Bath Road. It was in the 1950s when Heathrow started to take off, pardon the pun, with 3 more runways being constructed to form a Star of David layout. It was in 1955 when the airport would get its first passenger terminal, called the Europa Building, later Terminal 2, and would be located within the middle of the star which made up the airport, alongside a new 40-metre high air traffic control tower. In 1961, the airport would get a new passenger building called the Oceanic, later named Terminal 3, and would be used to host long-haul flights. When civil aviation was in its infancy, before the days of airport train station Wetherspoons were a thing, you might be thinking, how did folk get to the airport and occupy themselves pre-flight? Well, the answer in Heathrow's case was the West London Air Terminal, which opened in 1957 in the area of Kensington of all places, above the Cromwell Curve, which is a triangular section of the District Line where trains go from Gloucester Road up to High Street Kensington. The terminal would be exclusively used by British European Airways and would allow passengers to check in for their flights and do all the other airport things, except they were 11 miles away from their plane. They would then take a bus to Heathrow to board their flight. However, as you can imagine, this setup wouldn't survive for too long, with the terminal closing in 1974, and today it's put to good use with all its aviation background as a Sainsbury's. In the 1970s, at the airport itself, a lot of change would be going on. Terminals would be expanded, and alongside the arrival of new generation of jets, which required longer runways, it was so long to 3 of Heathrow's existing 6 runways. By 1977, the Piccadilly line would come to the airport, providing a direct rail link, allowing folk to get to central London in the speedy time of 1 hour. By the 1980s, Heathrow was handling over 30 million passengers a year, and with that, there was a demand to build a fourth terminal, which would open in 1986 by the world's most stable couple, the Prince and Princess of Wales. That extra capacity would only meet Heathrow's demands for 16 years until a fifth terminal was in the pipeline, opening in 2008 to a raft of technical issues and finally an answer to the age-old question of how many people does it take to change a light bulb, with the answer being they literally can't, as it wasn't accounted for within the design. It was in 2009 when we would say goodbye to the airport's oldest building, Terminal 2, which went from this to this, opening in 2014 and has Europe's longest permanent sculpture called the Slipstream, or more commonly known as the Tangled Steel Mess. At the end of the 2010s, with passenger numbers clocking 80 million annually, there has been increasing appetite for a new third runway, to some controversy, considering it would wipe the village of Harmondsworth off the map. But fortunately for the residents, you can always guarantee a good amount of pissing about from the government, and with the arrival of coronavirus, which has given aviation an absolute smacking, to Greta Thunberg's delight. So with the future of flying hanging in the balance, and a set of folk no doubt ready to glue themselves to a runway to stop it from being built, the saga of Heathrow's third runway goes on.